On today's show, we're going to discuss 14 of the most important injury situations you need to know for the 2024 fantasy football season. That includes players who sustained serious injuries last season, plus the camp injuries we've already had this year. Quick reminder, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is related to back-weighted fantasy production, guys getting healthy, ramping up down the stretch. That production, of course, is far more valuable to us than early season production. Let's get into it with the top 14 injuries for the 2024 fantasy football season. Let's start with number one, Nick Chubb. Now, this one is a little bit complicated to me. Tore his ACL, MCL, and meniscus on September 18th of last season. Ended up having 2 surgeries, which they claimed was normal, Stephania, but always scares me. 2 surgeries. They said one was to repair the MCL and the meniscus, and then another to repair the ACL. On top of that, the reason I think it's confusing to me is this is the same knee he blew out in 2015, although that one wasn't the ACL. It was MCL, PCL, LCL. So thoughts on Nick Chubb here, the 2 surgeries, the fact it's the same knee. Anything else you think on Nick Chubb here?
Yeah, he has now successfully injured all the CLs in your knee, the same knee. This one, all injuries make me sad. People used to ask me if I rooted for injury, which is the stupidest question on earth. They're like, oh, job security. And I said, if you've watched football for any period of time, you understand that injuries are inherent in the game. So there's I'm never rooting for players to get hurt, but we know it's going to happen. It's a collision sport. They're going to happen. But there are times where an injury takes my breath away and I get this overwhelming sadness. And that's what happened when Nick Chubb got hurt last year. I believe it was Minka Fitzpatrick's helmet that went into his knee. And it was just an unfortunate situation where the physics do not allow for the knee to go backwards. And when you see something like that happen, the knee is going to fail, but you just don't know how much damage is going to happen. And then knowing that he had the injury that you referenced when he was at Georgia and knowing how much damage there was that time, I rarely worry about a guy's career on a single injury. And I immediately did for Nick Chubb because of that. So just for people who might not be aware, when he had that multi-ligament injury at Georgia, that could have been the end of his football career. But he rehabbed incredibly hard. And if you know the work ethic of Nick Chubb, that doesn't surprise you. But what's amazing is he came back and posted 2 consecutive 1,000-yard rushing seasons and got himself drafted in the NFL. And people then sort of forgot with how well he performed in the NFL that he had this massive knee injury. So fast forward to him being the lone bright spot on the Browns offense for a number of years. And a guy who I think might be the most beautiful, pure runner in the NFL. I mean, if you just in terms of the old school running backs, and if you really just like to watch a guy who is powerful but glides, Nick Chubb is that way. And it's interesting because I often ask running backs when I'm talking to them, when I go to training camps at different places that I visit or do interviews, who they admire in the league. And universally, Nick Chubb is near the top of everyone's list. So when he got hurt last year, having a second knee dislocation on that same knee, you really wonder, what's the integrity of the joint going to be like? And the first thing you worry about is cartilage damage, because when you lose cartilage, you can't replace it. I mean, there are procedures if you have a focal, meaning a very specific size, certain dimension, because it can't be too big, lesion. There are cartilage replacement procedures, but they're not perfect. It doesn't match your original. You're never quite the same. And even though you've had good outcomes and some return to play, and that's really even a separate conversation, but that's like a Raheem Mostert surgical repair where you have a focal lesion that's fixed. But when you have blowouts of your knee, you risk massive trauma to the cartilage. So that was my number one concern. Then knowing he had all the ligament damage, and you wonder what else is, because you got blood vessels and just other soft tissue that's in there. And then, we started hearing about the damage, and they thought initially maybe his ACL wasn't torn. And the reason I'm explaining all this is it sets up for why the surgery was potentially staged. Because when they went in to do the first part, they could really visualize what the knee looked like. And I think that's when they knew, okay, we're going to have to fix this ACL. And we're going to start by doing this component first, see how he does, and then go forward with the ACL a little bit later. It's not routine, but it's not abnormal to do that. And there's a lot of factors that go into creating that decision. So I don't think anyone should think it was bad. I mean, it was definitely something that you can understand why that decision was made. Very good surgeon, Dr. Voos, who's the surgeon, head team physician for the Cleveland Browns, Dr. James Voos. So then it's wait and see. And I think what people need to understand is when you have a second massive surgery on a knee like that, usually your recovery is slower. You want to take more caution with the knee. You want to be a little bit more conservative in how you bring an athlete back for all the reasons that you would expect. And so while we look at an ACL timeline as being 9 to 12 months, when you consider the fact surgery was staged, that he had massive damage, that it was the second injury to that knee, you would expect them to naturally go a bit slower. And does it mean that it's going to fall outside of the 12-month window? Not necessarily, but he's a guy you're not going to be aggressive with. There's no push to get him back. And the Browns have basically told us this, right? No timeline. I mean, we had the general manager coming out and saying, yep, pump the brakes, because the viral videos of Nick Chubb lifting weights and bars bending, and everybody's like, oh, he's good. He's coming back. But that's not football. And every player will tell you it's different when you're playing football against an actual real defense. And as a running back, where you're the focal point of the defense, or if you're Nick Chubb and you have 4 or 5 guys hanging onto you to try and bring you down, the way you're loading that knee, you can't replicate it outside of the game.
So I did want to ask about that video. Do you think it matters at all that he squatted 585 pounds on his knee, or that's just nonsense that people see on social media? Because that sent his average draft position up like literally 2 rounds, just that one video.
I think the reason it does it is because people don't have anything else to watch to see evidence that he's actually doing well, right? So in your mind, you go, well, anybody who could squat that kind of weight is clearly not a guy who's limping around in a brace or tentative on his knee. Like, it starts inserting other ideas, right? Like, oh, well, if he can squat 600 pounds, then what's there to worry about? And that's where I would just remind people, it's not football. It's awesome. It tells you he's strong. Nick Chubb's legs before the injury were super strong. You need that strength back, but strength is only one component of what you need.
We have had a massive underweight position on Nick Chubb. In other words, we have been way behind market on Nick Chubb through this entire process. One of our concerns is not just that when will he be back, but part of what made him good, or most of what he made him good, was this like historic efficiency, like Stephania talked about. If he goes from one of the most efficient running backs in the league to a league average in efficiency or something like that, it's a problem because he does not a pass catcher. So I feel
it's
pretty
also
good
the
about
volume.
Yeah.
Right. Because
the volume, exactly.
Right. They're not necessarily, I mean, Nick Chubb was the predominant workhorse in that offense always. And even when he was sharing back with Kareem Hunt in those days, he was still the lead. Yeah. And you can't assume when somebody's coming off an injury like this, no matter who they are, no matter if it's awesome, incredible Nick Chubb, you don't just plunk them down and say, okay, here you go. You're the lead back and you're going to, touch the ball 22 times in a game. There's all this acclimation to the actual sport. And I talk about this all the time. My colleagues get annoyed, but there's return to play versus return to performance. So part of what we call the final phase of rehab is return to play, because that means all the restrictions are off and you're being allowed to actually put yourself into the sport so that your body can readjust to the sport, reacclimate, get the reactions back, all of that. But the only way to get that last phase of rehab is to actually do it. And you're usually not performing at your peak level for a while after that.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think we're on the same page with Nick Chubb. It is not a clean, we'll get to some clean ACL tears. It is not a clean one. People are like, oh, but what about Breece Hall? And we'll get to ACLs that were more like that than Nick Chubb here. Let's go to story number 2, which was TJ Hockenson.
Can I just say one more thing there?
Go ahead. Yes.
Because I was at Browns camp, and so I chatted with Jerome Ford, and he's definitely preparing. I mean, they love Nick Chubb. They have so much respect for him in that room. And the culture of the Browns has been just so heavy on the ground game. But I think they all respect and admire him, and his presence is definitely there. But I definitely got the sense that Jerome Ford is preparing. He will be the lead guy initially. I have no doubt about that. And it's a question of, I think people assume like Nick Chubb's around the corner, and just don't confuse him potentially being activated with when he might return to play. Like I just want people to understand, I think this is really going to be heavily Jerome Ford, who you can get for quite a value in most fantasy drafts right now.
Oh, yes.
Until, and again, even when Nick Chubb comes back, there's some proof there in terms of, not only performance and efficiency, but volume of work.
For sure. Yes. Jerome Ford will certainly remain involved, I think, even if Nick Chubb does make it back. All right. Number 2 story is TJ Hockenson. Now, this was an ACL and MCL tear, not PCL, not meniscus, just ACL and MCL for Hockenson. It was just very late in the season, January 29th surgery for TJ Hockenson. Thoughts on his outlook?
So he's one of those that, sometimes with the MCL injury, they want to wait on doing the ACL because it's in a position where it can heal on its own, but they want to give it that time. And that's what happened with him. So hence the late start to the surgery. I mean, I was also at Vikings, and Kevin O'Connell's talking about how great Hockenson looks. I saw him coming out to watch parts of practice. And he said, you watch him run and they know like the temptation is there. Like, oh, he looks so good. But O'Connell's a smart guy, and he's also like, I get it. Like, he's running, and that's one thing. He's just running on the field and he looks good. But all the stuff that comes back with ACL, which is the agility and the sense of where you are in space and being able to dig your foot into the ground and pivot. And if you're a big guy like TJ Hockenson, to be able to tolerate the weight of all these different people coming at you. So I think with the Vikings giving him the contract they did, knowing how they want to use him, the expectation is that he will be back this season, but I don't think he's going to be there at the beginning. I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see him for over a month in. Remember, that sweet spot is right around 9 to 12 months. And as you said, surgery in January, so you can sort of do the math. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's required that it's that amount of time, but the Vikings aren't interested in moving him up unnecessarily.
Yeah. I think, late October, November sounds more realistic for TJ Hockenson to me. Yeah. All right. Let's keep it moving here to a rookie, Jonathon Brooks. Now, all I could find on Jonathon Brooks, I think it was clean. You might know better. I think it was clean, just ACL. This was on November 11th. We have a surgery date of December 5 on Jonathon Brooks here. Does it matter that he's so young? Like, does it matter when you're rehabbing an ACL, A, that he's so young, and B, that obviously it matters if it was just an ACL. So yeah, any more thoughts on Jonathon Brooks here?
It does matter in the sense of like, we all feel better when we're younger. Everything's easier when we're younger. I can 100% vouch for that. But, there is something, if people are wondering, well, what about the older guys? Like, there is something if you've had certain injuries before and you sort of know the drill, and they're maybe a little bit less apprehensive because they've been through stuff before. But it's interesting because Jonathon Brooks, when I saw him at the combine, I was really watching, like, just how does he look? How comfortable is he walking around? A lot of people crowded. He wasn't working out at the combine, but this is funny. I don't think I've shared this before, so you're getting a little, but I saw him at the combine, and, players come to the podium at different stations so they can talk to the media. And then he went to the back. There's like a middle section. He went up, I think, to do like another media segment. And he was standing. And of course, I'm a lot of times watching these guys because that's what I do. I stare and I'm looking at how do they move and is there anything I'm going to pick up. And he was standing like on the edge of a studio spot and he slipped off it. And my heart immediately is thinking, oh my God, here he is fresh off the ACL. But he slipped and he caught himself. It was only about 6 inches. But if you step backwards off of something, it doesn't matter if it's not high. And it just all in that moment, I got to process him stepping off sight unseen and catching himself. And he did, it didn't like nothing. Didn't phase him. And I was like, that is a good sign. Like little things like that register well with me. So I do think everything you're hearing about his recovery makes a lot of sense to me. I will tell you this. There was a study that was done a while back, combine players entering the combine who had a history of an ACL tear. This, I think, was published in 2019. And if you came into the combine post ACL surgery, not necessarily like fresh off of it, but if you'd had one in your history, you had a 25% chance of suffering a second ACL injury on either side within 22 months of entering the league. And that is compared to like a 9% chance for guys with no history of an ACL tear. So there is a bump up in risk that we don't exactly know all the reasons that exist, but it just does.
As a 21-year-old who is only had a clean ACL tear, I think the outlook for Jonathon Brooks, Stephania is saying, is cleaner than it is for other guys. My concern on Jonathon Brooks is more the other stuff, the team-related stuff. This is a team that is not a Super Bowl contender, not a playoff contender, in my opinion. Bad offensive line. What is the motivation for the Panthers to bring him back and start giving him 20 touches a game? Now, the Jets did it with Breece Hall last year. I mean, they were dusted and out of it, and they were still giving Breece Hall huge workloads down the stretch. I know that's not an injury question. It's just a thought I have on Jonathon Brooks. I just want to say I am the outlier here. Everyone at ETR except for me, Stephania, is in on Jonathon Brooks big time.
No, I'm with you, and it's for what you're saying, but also the danger is sometimes these kids look really good, and so the temptation is to give them too much work. And the biggest, even though I gave you that stat about the risk of a secondary ACL injury, that's not really the biggest risk with these. The biggest risk is some other compensatory soft tissue injury in the aftermath. We see hamstring strains all the time. Sometimes it's a groin injury. Sometimes it's an ankle sprain or something else. More often than not, it's a hamstring injury. Why? Because everybody focuses on their quad strength coming back from these. Hamstrings often aren't quite as in balance, nor are they ready for deceleration. And deceleration ends up causing some of these injuries. It's basically the co-function of the quads and the hamstrings, and they end up with a deficit. And it's really, I said deceleration, but it's also acceleration too. There's actually both. I could get a little more in the weeds on it, but you know, those catapult data that people collect, the sensor data when they're looking at volume of work, it's through looking at things like that some of the rehab folks are starting to recognize where the deficits are post ACL. And I think that's why you've seen the timeline get pushed out a little bit. But every so often a team gets excited when a player comes back and looks good and they can't help themselves. And they give the athlete more work on the field than they probably are ready for. And then they end up tweaking something, and that sets them back.
Yeah, I mean, Canales had a quote along the lines of, "We love this kid. He's going to be part of our team for a long time. He's an awesome player." You know, they're not going to rush him back. I feel pretty confident in that. Let's go to...
Good for him, not great for fantasy.
Correct. Number 4 here is another clean ACL tear. Mike Williams tore his ACL on September 24th. Like I said, looks like a clean ACL tear. He will turn 30 in October of this year. Now, the Jets have said he's on the Breece Hall plan. The Breece Hall plan was active for week 1, but limited. Active for week 2 and week 3 and week 4, not full workload. And then they just started going nuts on, even when they were out of it. It was like, forget it. Breece Hall, go play every snap. Go get 25 touches in the game, which was awesome because I had a bunch of Breece Hall. But man, I was actually surprised the way they played it down the stretch. But anyways, at 30 years old, do you have a different outlook on Big Mike Williams here for the Jets?
It's interesting. I just sat with him yesterday. So you're getting this fresh off. I was at Jets camp and I chatted with him for about 15 minutes after practice. And the thing about Mike Williams is he's had some injuries that have been pretty significant. So he understands that he has to be really ready to play the style of game that he plays. And I asked him specifically about contested catches. I mean, he's very physical in the red zone. And that means you've got to be able to go up in the air and land potentially on that leg blind and have confidence that it's going to support you when you land. And he said to me, and I'm the PT, I know this, and this is what you're usually saying to the athlete. But he said to me, there's only one way to get those reps and that confidence, and that's, in-game stuff. And until you're doing it, he's like, I can't wait to go against a defender. Right now, he's still doing individual work as you and I are recording this. He's not even doing team drills yet. But he knew that the only way to get that back is that there's going to be some rehab through getting comfortable in a game, playing against real defenders who want to take you out. And the story he shared with me was that, because I asked him, I said, it's hard. Sometimes guys are nervous or apprehensive when they're coming back from this. And he goes, yeah, well, he goes, I already came back from a broken neck. And I was reminded that he fractured his neck when he was at Clemson. And he said when he first came back, he was like, oh, okay, I got this. And he said he went up for a ball and he's like, defenders were trying to take him out. Like, no respect for the fact that he was coming back from a neck fracture. So he's like, I know what that's like. On the one hand, the great part is if you come back from a broken neck, you're probably not going to be so apprehensive about an ACL. But also he understands, like, that's the part that you need to overcome. And that takes a different amount of time for different guys. So I think he's doing really well in his progression. He's not wearing a brace, looks good moving, but it's just him moving on air right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting spot for Mike Williams. If he can still play, if he can be himself off this ACL tear, the Jets need him. I mean, badly, the Jets need him. They do not have much behind Garrett Wilson in the pass catcher department. All right, let's get to the old quarterback Achilles injuries. Now, I am 41, almost 42. I feel like I'm going to blow out my Achilles. I wake up with these like sore Achilles, and then I try to go play basketball or tennis. I'm just like, so sure I'm going to pop it, especially after.
You might be. You're at the prime age. We used to call it middle-aged man syndrome. And
that's what I was going to say, especially after 36-year-old Kirk Cousins and 41-year-old, almost 41-year-old Aaron Rodgers did it last season. I was like, my God, I can't even take this. Now,
play pickleball, because pretty much that's the setup for it. There's so many of the rise in Achilles injuries because of pickleball is incredible.
I still try to pretend that I am tough and only play tennis, not pickleball. However, I get it. Kirk Cousins had his Achilles surgery on November 11th. Aaron Rodgers was much earlier. He went down on opening night with his Achilles rupture. The crazy thing to me is I used to think Achilles was like the worst thing ever. No one can come back from it. Guys are coming back from it faster now, but even these old guys, I guess as statue quarterbacks, it's not as big a deal. I did see a video of Kirk Cousins like doing a 6-yard scramble a couple weeks ago at practice. What is going on here? So is it really not that severe for these old quarterbacks? Do you think that there is any fear of aggravation on them, or is it just like it's always been, they're going to stand in the pocket and try to throw Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers?
And I think this is one area where the surgical procedure and the rehab from it have both evolved in a way that allows for better return to function. I mean, it's much better. If you saw Cam Akers play in that preseason game, I mean, he's now torn 2 Achilles, and I thought he looked pretty good the way he was moving. It used to be a death sentence for a running back for sure, and most players weren't coming back. But now the way that they do these procedures, some still do a bigger, more broad open incision, but there are a couple foot and ankle specialists who do what they call a mini open, so a little tiny incision. So less scar tissue, less chance of infection. All of that means better, smoother healing. It's also the way that they can secure the repair, the way they suture it, the materials they're using. That less scar is really important, because if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can go look at a picture, like Google a picture of an Achilles and the calf muscle. You can just see the lines, like it's all in line. And if you think about what that tendon does, it stretches, it loads energy. And then when you push off, it stretches out and bounces back. And when you have scar, it's very disorganized, like it lays down in all kind of funky ways. And that doesn't allow for this smooth stretch and release of a tendon. Imagine if you can minimize the scar and basically shape it in a way that allows the functionality of the tendon to be improved. Maybe you do get that explosiveness and that push and that spring back a little bit better. Plus your healing time is a little bit less. And I think we just understand that there's more to do in rehab now. It's just gotten far more expansive in terms of what you can do to promote soft tissue healing and progressive loading. The things that Aaron Rodgers was doing in rehab, he had a very specific rehab. Remember, he was trying to get back very quickly.
Yeah.
But the way they were measuring out in very small amounts, okay, you can do this much more today. And then how does it react to that? And then maybe this little bit more the next day. And it's just so much more complex than people can imagine. And those things all together are allowing these guys to get back. So Aaron Rodgers, who was targeting late last season, ends up with all this extra time, which means the tendon only has that much more time to continue to repair and remodel itself and get stronger. He looked like he was moving around fine to me. The ones were working predominantly yesterday because the 2s and 3s, played in a lot of the games, so to get more rest. He looked fine. He looks like he's a little older guy. He's not moving as quick as he used to when he was in his 20s, but there's nothing visible where you'd go, oh yeah, he's hurting. And I imagine Kirk Cousins is the same.
Yeah, we have no docs on either of those guys. Feel pretty good on that. All right, let's get to the Bionic Man, J.K. Dobbins. Now, I have a checkered history with J.K. Dobbins. I tweeted some skepticism a couple years ago.
Oh, he'll find you.
Oh, he found me. And he replied and quote tweeted me. So we're now close personal friends. But anyways, since that incident, and by the way, the incident I was referring to was he was coming off of ACL, LCL, meniscus in August of 2021. That one was a mess. I mean, he was out there in late 2022, like dragging his leg around, but still being productive somehow. Anyways, makes it back on the field. But September 2023, last season, now he blows out his Achilles. I honestly thought at that point, I felt bad for him, I felt like his career was completely over. Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman want to install some crazy run-heavy attack, and they have pegged 32-year-old Gus Edwards and the Bionic Man, J.K. Dobbins, as the guys to do it with. So something is off here. Either we're wrong and J.K. Dobbins is going to be fine, or the Chargers are wrong and they have a big problem. So what do you think about J.K. Dobbins?
This one, listen, I am at a bit of a loss here myself because of exactly what you meant, like the room, right? The room, like the two guys, it makes sense. Okay, you want guys you can plug into your offense. And because Greg Roman knows Gus and JK so well, and that, it fits with what Harbaugh wants to do, scheme-wise, you're like, okay, if everything goes well, these guys are going to be a perfect fit. But then I think about, well, what does the volume of work look like? It's one, they're going to be able to execute it. And like JK's recovery, he's documented it well. He was rehabbing with Aaron Rodgers, so same place. I can't say enough about the rehab process. Same surgeon as Aaron. So they were really, rehabbing in parallel there. But it's still can he look good for a couple of runs? But what happens when you're giving him the ball over and over, and how much work are they willing to give him? And this is where I don't know, because remember back when the time period you're talking about when he was coming off the ACL, he was adamant about getting back week 1. And I felt badly for him a bit there because I understand that these guys have all this attention on them. And there's these markers they feel they have to hit, like get back for the beginning of the season or it's a failure, get back. But he would have benefited so much by having a little more time that I wonder if he wouldn't have looked better sooner if he had delayed his return. And now it's a little bit of a similar concern. So I was at Chargers camp, but he had a veteran day that day. And that makes sense. It didn't worry me, but I didn't really get to see him do anything. Gus Edwards, they were managing from, Harbaugh doesn't talk about injuries. So there's something undisclosed that Gus Edwards had. Kamani Vidal had, he was doing limited work because of a hamstring. I'm not convinced that they have really a fully healthy room to start.
Yeah.
So I am happy for JK that he feels as good as he does. I know he's a guy who is always out to prove that people have been wrong about him. You know this well. But I just don't know what his volume of work looks like. And I think it goes one of two ways. One is he doesn't have enough to really equal what you think an RB1 should have. And the other is that he does too much too soon and it ends up taking a toll.
I will say he goes very late, and I still haven't taken J.K. Dobbins at all, but he does go very late. The opportunity cost is not that high. I prefer him better in home leagues where we can see what he looks like. If he looks great in week 1, great. If not, we can just drop him and move on. Obviously,
Right.
can't do that in best ball. So
Right.
that's one that I think is pretty clear for me in terms of best ball versus home league. Let's get to Anthony Richardson, number 8 here. Anthony Richardson had an AC joint sprain, which I've heard of plenty. I guess it was so bad he needed surgery. Now, since then, he's looked completely fine. And there was a video I tweeted of him dunking, like some absurd, like would have won the dunk contest dunk where he moves his shoulder in all kinds of crazy positions. He's been out there at camp, played in the preseason game. There's still a faction of the fantasy community who just assumes Anthony Richardson is going to get hurt again this season. But what do you think about the shoulder? Or should we be worried about aggravation on such a rushing focused quarterback?
I was worried when I heard about the injury because it's tough on a thrower, right? If you don't get everything exactly right, then that means every time you come over the top, where you're going to stress that AC joint, is it going to be problematic, or you're going to have residual soreness, pain, whatever. I got to tell you, I've been so impressed with his rehab, which has been really pretty smooth. Natural to have a little bit of soreness, whether it's in your biceps or around that area as you're coming back. He's another one. I was with him in Jacksonville where he trains in July. And I am here to tell you that the way he throws the ball, there's nothing missing on it. I mean, he throws that ball hard.
Yeah.
He has no problems. His movement, they were actually doing motion capture on him so you could see it 3D imaged all the way around. Like his follow through, which is what I looked at, because for AC joint repair, a lot of times they don't want to come across their body as they're following through on a throw. He's got no issues. So for him, it's really about just improving as a quarterback in the NFL. We've already heard that they don't plan to limit his runs at all. I think he understands, like, let's be sensible about it. It's not going to stop him from being a runner.
Yeah. They had some quote I thought it was a really good quote. It was like, you're not going to tell Steph Curry to stop shooting threes or something like that. If you tell Anthony Richardson that he can't run, he is not worth the 4th overall pick in the NFL draft. You just can't do that. I mean,
you can't play scared, basically.
Yeah, and you can tell him that he needs to run out of bounds. And I thought there was a play in the first preseason game where maybe last year he would have lowered his shoulder and tried to run over the dude.
I know what play you're talking about.
He went out of bounds.
I saw it and I thought the exact same thing.
Yeah. So I feel good about Anthony Richardson again. Very small sample, but did lead all quarterbacks in fantasy points per drop back last season.
And that, to me, that's a stat I've used over and over again, because I'm like, you can take that, the sample size was 5 games or something like that. And you can take that and still have it be meaningful when you look at those points per drop back, because it's a relative score.
For sure. All right. Number 9 here was an injury that happened during camp. Justin Herbert. This was very early in camp. Justin Herbert diagnosed with a plantar fascia injury. Now, rushing production from Justin Herbert isn't great, but it's also not nothing. 911 yards, 11 rush touchdowns in 62 NFL games. Do you think a plantar fascia injury will affect Justin Herbert's mobility in the pocket or out of it this season?
So let me just start by saying I'm totally biased right now, because I tore my medial band of my plantar fascia like a few weeks ago.
Oh.
I'm here to tell you it is one of the most painful injuries I've ever had in my life. And I've taken care of a number of athletes with varying degrees of whether it's plantar fasciitis or actually an acute rupture or a partial tear. It's a spectrum of injury. It's not all one size fits all. And they've tried to give me, the descriptions. I still think Antonio Gates, going old school here, had the best one. When you talked about it, it's like when you take a knife and you stick it in hot butter and it just cuts in. And I was like, oh yeah. Or people talk about walking on broken glass. And mine is that it feels like an ice pick is going into my heel when I take a step, especially in the morning. So now knowing that, and knowing that as a quarterback, forget the running. You have to just stand on 2 feet to begin with and put your weight down on it. If it's painful, it will be painful with every step. So the key is, can you get it to where it's manageable and not so painful? That's why they put him in a boot for 2 weeks, to try and take the stress off. It elevates your heel, so you're not putting all that stress through the arch. Because your plantar fascia is basically the thick tissue on the bottom of your foot that supports your arch. So every time you step flat, it stretches. If you have a partial tear, you're continuing to tug at the thing that is partially torn. So you elevate it. Sometimes they'll cast guys. If they really don't want them weight bearing, they'll cast them for a week or 2. Now, sometimes that reprieve is enough to get over the acutely painful stage, allow the tissue to start to scar in a little bit, and you don't do too badly. But if you step wrong again, you tear it a little more, like it has the potential to be a lingering problem. You may have heard people say, it's better if you tear the whole thing versus a partial tear.
Mm-hmm.
Because, well, once you tear the whole thing, there's nothing to tug at anymore that's going to cause pain. Now, it's not great for the support of your arch, and you risk having problems with your foot being flatter and down the line. But we don't know the degree of injury here, and that's what makes it hard to project. The other thing we know about Justin Herbert is super tough. He's played through incredible pain before. So do I think he's going to miss time the way they have it set up? No, because he's a guy who plays through everything. But to your point, how effective can he be? Can he move in and around the pocket? Can he get, if people are harassing him at his feet all the time, is it going to be a problem? Maybe.
Yeah.
We just really have no way of knowing.
If this is a pain tolerance thing, can they just give him an injection before the game and he won't feel the pain and he'll be okay?
So it's really interesting because, you don't typically want to inject cortisone into an area where you have that type of tissue because it will make it fail. But I do know of times where cortisone injections have been given with partial tears or it's so close to a full rupture, they're like, number one, it's going to make you feel better. Number two, if it fully goes,
right,
then that's not a bad situation. So there can be, I have talked to a couple foot and ankle docs who are doing some different things with what we call orthobiologics. So some, platelet-rich plasma is an orthobiologic. That's not what's used in this case, but there are some other things that they're trying. I know I've talked to a couple of docs who treat NCAA athletes who have used it and gotten some success in getting them past the painful point and accelerating the healing. So I think there are things to try, but there's always that worry that you're going to aggravate it again during the season.
Okay, let's get to another quarterback here for number 10, Deshaun Watson. Now, a lot of people want to blame all kinds of other things for the way Deshaun Watson has played when he's been on the field. And maybe that's part of it. Got this absurd contract, all the off-field stuff. Maybe he doesn't want to play ball. People have speculated all that stuff. I think his shoulder looks like broken last season. Hurt his rotator cuff in week 3. Comes back in week 7. Never really seemed right. Seemed to hurt his shoulder again in week 12. Diagnosis at that point was a displaced fracture to the glenoid in his shoulder. I mean, this seems like something I never heard of before, a really rare shoulder injury. I don't even know what to make of this, but I'm not that worried about the off-field stuff. I'm worried that his shoulder is like permanently broken, and the Browns, who gave him $230 million guaranteed, are like, well, he better get out there because we have $230 million guaranteed. You better get out there anyways. So what's going on with Deshaun Watson?
Well, the good news is, and you're right to be alarmed because it's not an injury you hear of every day in a quarterback. But basically the glenoid is the socket. So, your arm, the shoulder is the ball here, and it goes in on your shoulder blade has this round sort of flat, surface kind of shaped like a saucer. And that's the glenoid. And so when you have a fracture of it, and it's displaced, means it's out of position. You have to realign the piece, like putting a little jigsaw puzzle pieces back in place and then securing them so that the bone can properly heal. So that was step 1. Number 2, when you have a fracture like that, the labrum gets torn. So you have to repair the labrum. We know we don't love labral repairs in throwers because sometimes that starts changing their arc of throwing. So, he had an excellent surgeon and Dr. Neil Elatrosh, who has done these before and operates on baseball pitchers who have a much more demanding arc of throwing than a quarterback. And so the balance is stability. You fix the problem. You have to make that shoulder stable again. Part of the reason he didn't look right, it was fractured in there, probably felt like it was slipping with the labrum torn. Like, you just can't effectively set up your throws no matter what. So that's why he looked like non-functional, had to get fixed. But when you are creating that stability, you run the risk of compromising the motion. So the surgeon's challenge is, how do you allow for normal motion to be able to throw and still give him stability at the joint? And I think he's got that. And he's been throwing pretty well. He's another one where when it gets to volume, that's what's going to be interesting. Like, he's on a progression back that should have him ready. So, he's practicing, he's doing the right stuff, but a full workload of a game in addition to taking some shots to the shoulder, that'll be where we see, like, how does he hold up?
Yeah, I mean, with our inputs, not assuming that he's hurt, he's a pretty good value for us because we expect the Browns to switch to a more throw-heavy attack without Nick Chubb, and because he gave you good rushing stuff, last year. I mean, did run 26, 142, 1 in just 5 games. So if Deshaun Watson is right and the shoulder is right, I actually think he's probably a good value. Like Stephania said, we're going to have to see on workload, I think, for Deshaun Watson. Let's get to a couple quick ones here from camp. Marquise Brown dislocated the SC joint in the preseason opener. Report is 4 to 6 weeks on Marquise Brown. Everybody seems to be saying 4 to 6 weeks on this. Do you think when he comes back on that 4 to 6 week timetable, we should be concerned at all, or is he good to go after that 4 to 6 weeks?
I think, the thing for him is he's going to have to get hit and fall down again and know that it feels okay, because the big thing about it is it's uncomfortable. It can be super painful. The SC is where your sternum, your chest bone, and your clavicle, your collarbone meet. And the thing is, when you dislocate, it can go forward or backward. And if it goes backwards, it's going towards the most important blood vessels in your body. And that's why they take you to a hospital. They have to image it. CAT scan is usually what you need to really see it properly. They have to reduce it if it's dislocated, because it doesn't necessarily just pop back in on itself. Andy Reid said he didn't need surgery. You can reduce a dislocation like that closed, meaning they don't have to cut through the skin, but there are other times where they do. So, in fact, no surgery, good. But then you've got to immobilize the arm for a while. Usually it's a sling, because when you move your arm, you're moving that joint, which is why it's considered part of the shoulder. So you have to be in a sling and allow these ligaments and everything to scar down again so that it's stable. Because what you don't want is something that's moving around and flimsy, because the risk of severe injury from that with contact is the problem. Once you get to a point where you're comfortable that it's stable, the tissue's healed, it's at no further risk than it was, before you had the big injury, then really he should be ready to go. It shouldn't change his function. It's just the mental aspect of coming back. Tyreek Hill actually had this. Don't know, again, scale of severity, direction, all of that. We don't have that information. But Tyreek Hill came back and he was just fine.
Yeah. I mean, the Rashee Rice stuff is super interesting now because we still haven't heard about the suspension. There's rumblings out there he may not be suspended much, if at all, this season. And then you get the Marquise Brown injury on top of this. So we've really moved up Rashee Rice pretty strongly in the ranks. Another training camp injury was Josh Downs, diagnosed with a high ankle sprain in practice last week. These high ankles, I mean, I feel like Austin Eckler's whole season last year was ruined by a high ankle. I remember Saquon had one he tried to play through and was a mess. Jerry Jeudy had a whole season that he tried to play through wrecked by a high ankle. I don't want that. I don't want that to happen to Josh Downs, but it seems like it's just inevitable. Like, these guys don't recover from high ankles fast enough. Any more thoughts on Josh Downs and high ankles?
I mean, I think all your observations are good ones. It's just a tough injury to recover from. And again, there's degrees of severity with these, and the most significant ones require surgery. And the very mild ones will do pretty well with being immobilized in a boot. Again, occasionally they'll cast them for a couple days, but most of the times it's a boot, and then they rehab back and they come back, and those do pretty well. But it's everything in between that's hard, because if it's enough that there's some instability, but not so much that you would automatically go to surgery, then you're really in the wait and see mode, and you have to make sure it's going to be ready for you to return. And these, especially when they happen in season or close to the season, guys are trying to push to come back, and it might be a little on the early side. And the problem is with the high ankle, it's the ligaments that basically form the roof of the ankle. So it's where your two lower leg bones come together, right above where you think of your traditional ankle. So as the ankle's moving in the joint, when you step down, it normally would put a gapping stress on those two lower leg bones. Well, when the ligaments are intact, they're not going anywhere. But if you damage the ligaments with a high ankle sprain, you basically get an increased separation of the two lower leg bones. So Imagine feeling that every time you step and that those bones are like spreading apart. That doesn't feel good. And it not only is it painful or can be painful, it feels nasty and unstable. And guys can't rotate because the rotation increases that stress. So directional change, landing and cutting, those things are really hard when you come back from a high ankle sprain.
I feel like if they called it something else, people would take it more seriously because people are like, oh, it's a high ankle. It's an ankle sprain. Don't be soft. Get back out there. But this is like really severe. So
I think it's because of just that. They don't understand like where it is and what it does. That makes it different from like a basketball ankle sprain.
For sure. Yeah. So pretty worried about Josh Downs here. We have docked him very significantly, even though it sounds like he'll likely be back sometime in September. Other training camp injury, DeAndre Hopkins. This was very early in camp, just out of nowhere. Knee strain for DeAndre Hopkins, out 4 to 6 weeks. Now, they did say he won't need surgery. I haven't seen any other details on this. This guy is 32 years old with a knee strain, out 4 to 6 weeks here in August. I'm a little queasy on DeAndre Hopkins at this point. Stephania, are you worried about him?
Yeah, mostly because of what we don't know, what they're not telling us, which they don't have to. I mean, that's the luxury of training camp is they really don't have to give us much. And the thing about timetables in training camp is they're hard to gauge because you don't know. Teams start getting really conservative because you're not bringing a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, a seasoned veteran who, remember when he was at Texas, he would not practice a lot during the week and he would show up and play his tail off, right? Yeah. And there was never any question about his productivity, but he was sort of always banged up. Well, now you add that he's, X amount older now. They're not going to bring him back. So was it really a 4 to 6 week injury? Maybe they're being super conservative, knowing if they push the timeline out there into week 1 or 2, it allows him to sort of see how he's doing. It's just a hard one to gauge because there's no detail around it.
For sure. Last one I had on the list before today was Puka Nacka. Puka Nacka in a joint practice a couple Sundays ago hurt his knee. McVay has been honest mostly on injuries. He didn't seem to express much concern, called it a bursa sack and called Puka week to week, but did say it won't affect his preparation for week 1. We initially docked Puka Nacka in the rankings and moved Cooper Kupp up some. We've backed off that a little bit and now have Puka Nacka kind of middling it. Where do you think Puka will be at come week 1?
Yeah, I think he'll be ready to go week 1. They got a great rehab staff out there. I think this whole week to week, I think that's exactly right. And McVay, like you said, was so honest. I actually referenced that on a show today. I'm like, we love when, at least I do, like you give me the details about it and then I can say, okay, yeah, I sort of agree with you. I think they were very transparent. It's a time of year where he doesn't have to push it. So, you don't love a guy getting hurt. Puka played through a lot of stuff. Like he got banged up a lot last year. I don't know if people remember. There were a couple times where you're like, is he going to make it through the game? He was definitely playing hurt. And he's big, so it's going to happen. But I'm not overly alarmed by this.
Okay. The one that happened today, mere hours before we came on to this very prestigious podcast, was Vikings rookie J.J. McCarthy hurts his knee, goes for an MRI a couple days later, has a meniscus injury. There's a lot of docs out there that think they're a lot of reporters out there who think they're docs now, Stephania, because they say that they can't give a timeline until they actually do the procedure to find out whether it's a trim or repair of the meniscus. If it is indeed a repair, J.J. McCarthy allegedly will be out for the season. What do you think about this whole J.J. McCarthy situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. When you have a meniscus injury, I'm contrary to popular opinion, because it used to be people like, oh, meniscus, so they'll be back in 2 to 4 weeks. Like everybody's got the automatic timetable, but just like anything else, matters where it is. What's the severity? There's like, if you opened a book on knee injuries and you were looking at the meniscus section, you would see all these different patterns of tears. Like they're not all alike. And there's parts of the meniscus that have a blood supply and there's parts that really don't. And so if it's a section that really doesn't, it's probably not going to heal well. If you have a section where there's some blood vessel infiltration, okay, that has a better chance of healing. All of those things will factor into how they approach treating it when they get in there surgically, and they can visualize it better when they get in there. So that's where that comment is coming from when Kevin O'Connell said they're going to decide when they go to surgery. That's partly why. Maybe they don't have the clearest image. Maybe they want to see, is this something that we can do, X, Y, or Z that's fairly straightforward, get him out and have it just be this light, like a debridement meniscectomy, where you're taking out just a little piece or kind of shaving something down. The reason you want to do a repair, if it's an injury that warrants a repair and is amenable to repair, is because the meniscus serves a protective function in your knee joint. And from the olden times, when it was like, oh, it's torn, we'll just take that out, and they started studying people in follow-up years, the rate of advancement of arthritis in the joint is massively accelerated when you take out the meniscus. So it has a critical function. You don't want to just take a piece out, a chunk out for no reason if it's going to be amenable to repair. So look, they've invested in this kid. Mm-hmm. They're looking at him for the future. If it warrants repair, they will do it. There is no rush to bring him back, but that is multiple months of recovery. And if he doesn't end up needing a repair, there's something that's an easier fix, if you will. It doesn't mean they were trying to rush to get him back. Like, they're going to do what's in the best interest of JJ McCarthy here. And so we wait and see what they discover in surgery.
If he ends up needing just the trim, when do you think he could get back?
Then it's a pretty simple scope, and we usually say 2 to 4 weeks, but sometimes it takes a little longer depending on the swelling and how each person behaves. But and again, they wouldn't be rushing him, and we never thought really that he was going to likely be the starter for the season. So then it's missed time with practice, missed reps, and all of that. So even if I said 2 to 4 weeks in terms of being cleared for football, I think there's still a delay. It further delays his initiation.
I mean, even before all this, we didn't think that he would make his debut until October or maybe even November, and so if he just needs the trim, nothing changes. If he does need the full repair and he's out for the season, though, we are going to need to talk a bunch about Sam Darnold, because he will project very well for us with these weapons in this scheme. I know nobody wants to hear it, but that is the truth on Sam.
It is crazy. I was just in Minnesota. Like, I was just there the other day. And so I got to watch both of them in practice, and it was just really interesting. And by the way, JJ spoke to the media that day, and I'm telling everyone who will listen, like, I saw him when Michigan was making their run. I saw him afterwards, and he just said, "Oh, good kid. Like, he seems too good to be true." I am telling you, when you are standing there in his presence and he's talking, I was like, I'm buying whatever he said. Like, he is just this most authentic, pure, sweet kid. And I'm devastated for him that this happened, but he's really, I think they just love him in the building because of who he is. And so let him go forward at the pace that works for him. And Vikings fans can, like, the sky hasn't fallen. Sam Darnold, I think, could be capable in this offense, as you mentioned. And JJ will come back when he's ready.
All right. We have said it all on 2024 fantasy football injuries. I learned a ton. Hopefully you all did as well. Stephania, really appreciate the time. Let the people know where they can find you. Assuming you want to be found, let them know where they can find you and where they can find your work.
Yes, on the X platform. When you put something on there, it's a tweet, right?
Yes.
Like, it's still a tweet. Stephania _ESPN, and then at Stephania Bell on Instagram, where I'm going to try and do some little informational videos, more of this during the season, because I know people are curious. People always want more and more information. So I'm going to try and do a little bit more of that. But please watch us Sundays on Fantasy Football Now when the regular season begins. We do a 3-hour pregame show every Sunday. And as you mentioned at the top, we're doing a preview Fantasy Football Now on Monday as part of the Fantasy Football Marathon. It's actually on from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. I don't know if we're going to switch networks because there's a whole Little League World Series thing going on, but either ESPN or ESPN2, one of the two, from 7 to 11.
I feel like they're always moving the show and the channel and the time on you guys. If anyone at ESPN is listening, this is what the people want. This is what they want. Stop moving the channel. Stop moving the time. Let people get into a routine of consuming fantasy content on ESPN. Stephania didn't say it. I did. She would never cross her bosses like that. All right. that is going to do it for Stephania, for producer Luke, for producer Ryan. I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.